Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Hugh Jones. I'm a principal oboe player with the QSO. Welcome to the QSO's Health and Wellbeing Supporter Connect event here in the QSO studios in South Bank. Today, I'm excited and a little bit overawed to be joined by some of Queensland's foremost experts in health and wellbeing who've decided to partner with the QSO in making our health and wellbeing initiative a reality. Dr. Dimini Dornan, AO, Founder and Executive Director of Hear and Say, Professor Bridie Lee Bartlett from Griffith University, and Miss Gemma Hodgett, Executive Director of Health and Wellbeing Queensland. Please welcome our panel. Just a little bit about our health and wellbeing program. Our program is designed to bring hope, health and happiness to our communities. The strategy for the QSO Health and Wellbeing Program is built around 3 pillars. Pillar number 1 is healthy ageing. What can QSO do for aged care? What can we do in the research and treatment of conditions like dementia? How can we address social isolation that can come about as people age and their support networks fracture? So that's pillar number 1. Pillar number 2 is our communities. How does QSO deliver wellbeing for our local communities, our regional communities, our First Nations communities, and those communities with special needs? And finally, pillar number 3, we call this we're sharing the joy. And this is really just providing a bit of joy and a bit of temporary respite in places that need it, such as hospitals. On Friday evening, in fact, we're putting on a free concert for frontline health workers to give them some joy and to say thank you to them for the amazing work they've done during the pandemic. This is in partnership with Health and Wellbeing Queensland and QPAC as part of our We're Sharing the Joy. Personally, as someone who has been a professional musician for 20 years now, I've always known the positive impacts of music. I've experienced it in my own life. And when I began teaching music at the age of 18, I started to see how different children and adults respond to regular musical engagement. That was 20 years ago, but now there's a significant body of evidence outlining how music, and particularly classically oriented instrumental music, has significant benefits towards brain development, emotional development, social development, and well-being. So, to this end, QSO has commissioned a literature review undertaken by the Queensland Conservatorium Griffith University to connect the dots, really, amongst the broad body of research conducted over the last 10 years or so. Professor Bridie Lee Bartlett is an Australian Research Council Future Fellow and Professor at the Queensland Conservatorium Research Centre and Creative Arts Research Institute at Griffith University. That's quite a mouthful. Professor Bartlett is one of the world's leading community music scholars. Professor Bartlett, thank you very much for joining us today. It's wonderful to have you. Could you just give us a little bit of a snapshot of your role at Griffith University? What exactly are you involved in through Griffith?
Sure, thank you, Hugh. I'd love to do that. But first of all, it's just such a delight to be in a room with fellow musicians and music lovers and supporters who have a passion for learning more about the health and wellbeing benefits of music making. So it's a delight to be here. So thank you for the invitation. As you mentioned, I'm a professor at the Queensland Conservatorium Griffith University, just next door, and I'm lucky enough to be an Australian Research Council Future Fellow, which means I get to spend 4 years doing intense research into the role that music can play in addressing some of the greatest social inequalities in Australia. So it's a wonderful opportunity. But prior to taking on that, for 6 years I was the director of the Queensland Conservatorium Research Centre, which I have to say was the dream gig, because I got to work in partnership with a number of arts organisations and NGOs, really keen to understand but also articulate the social benefits that come from music making and the cultural contribution that they're making to Australian communities. So as you can imagine, that took me to all sorts of interesting contexts, from remote First Nations communities to prisons to education settings to health settings and a raft of others in between, both in Australia and overseas. And this work increasingly is actually reaching outside the arts sector. I think there's a lot of potential for partnerships like what we're seeing today with the health sector to think about how we can bring our different approaches together to come up with creative and innovative solutions to some of the most pressing issues facing our society today. So that's a little snapshot of some of the work that I've been doing, and I'm of course so interested to see what's happening here, and so impressed that QSO is partnering with amazing health partners here to think about how we can creatively be working together and serving the communities of Queensland and beyond in this regard.
That's great. I was very interested to read, you know, you're a music scholar, and your work has covered things from economics to criminology.
Yes.
Could you give us a little bit of an example of your work and how it touched those sectors?
Absolutely. I'm really interested in how music connects with a raft of other different fields. And you mentioned criminology. We were blessed to have an Australia Research Council linkage project where we partnered with Serco and looked at performing arts programs that are happening across Australian prisons, because we wanted to understand the benefits that were happening in those programs, what those sorts of opportunities could offer those who are living in prison, but also how it could enhance the corrections environment as well. And so that was a really interesting opportunity to think about how we translate the benefits of the arts to a very different context and how we have a conversation across very different fields. And so, as I said, I think there's a great potential for us to be thinking about music reaching out. And I think the more we reach out into other fields, the deeper our understanding about music actually becomes. The more we think about the health benefits and how it's a fundamental part of being a human, we appreciate music all the more. So a lot of this research is also trying to articulate to policymakers, to government, about the benefits of music. They're cultural and they're social, but they're also actually economic and educational.
Just for a minute, could you give us an example of how it might be economic and educational as well? You know, if any of us here, obviously yourselves included, but any of us, I suppose, talking to people who are in policy making and in government, what are those sort of economic or educational benefits of music?
Well, economics, of course, has many dimensions to it. So you can think about the livelihoods of the musicians who are being employed, but what people don't think about is all of the other embedded workers that might be involved in putting on a concert. Let's take the QSO, for example. There are a lot of people who are working behind the scenes who you might not think about when you come to a performance, and there's an economic dimension to the contributions that they're making as well there. Economics also can involve the volunteering that might happen behind the scenes, and you could quantify those contributions as significant. And then, of course, there are a ripple effect if you go and think about going on tour into those regional communities, the audiences who might come along to a performance, they might go out to dinner, and there's a ripple effect. I could go on, but the point being that in a musical event, there are many different embedded economic opportunities that exist. But of course, what's driving us is actually the music, and we need to always remember that that's the primary purpose of what we're doing.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Bridie. So, as I explained before, your involvement in this program was as part of the commissioning of a literature review. Could you tell us a little bit about that literature review and what were some of the key findings from that literature review?
Sure. Well, it was a great delight to be commissioned to do this, and I must acknowledge, of course, it's been wonderful to work with the fabulous Tony Palmer here and the visionary Chris Freeman as well, and I thank them for this opportunity. And I must acknowledge I had a fabulous senior research assistant, Dr. Jack Walton, who did a lot of the grunt work and the reading. I think Jack needed glasses after this. So, look, what we wanted to do was two things. First of all, we wanted to get a sense of the evidence base around music, health and wellbeing. And this is really where I commend QSO in saying there is a huge evidence base, and when we're playing in the health space, we need to look at it and look at what we can learn from it, so that what we do in this space is really informed by that evidence base, and we can make sure that the wellbeing benefits that can come from these QSO programs are really living up to their full potential. So the first objective was really to gather that evidence base. The second was to make it digestible. I don't know if any of you have tried to read a little into the health and well-being space when it comes to music. It is incredibly overwhelming. It's disparate. You've got medical professionals, music therapists, sociologists, music education people. It is huge and vast and all over the place and really hard to penetrate. So our job wasn't to do yet another academic systematic literature review, but it was to say, how can we distill the most pertinent findings into something that's easily digestible and then shareable with the QSO community interested in this. In terms of our findings, we're all music lovers and musicians in the room. We know from lived experience the health benefits that can come from participating in music, but it was quite something to see this huge evidence base confirming it. I think we need to also acknowledge that context and specificity matters. So while we're staying at a high macro level talking about this, how the music programs are actually delivered, where they're delivered, what kind of music is used actually does matter. So it makes it really hard to make big generalizations. But when you look at this evidence base together, it's staggering. It tells a really compelling story about the role of music in our health and well-being. Now, of course, the field is vast. We saw studies from palliative care wards to community drop-in centres, aged care facilities, detention centres, prisons, and orchestral settings as well. So the field and the contexts are really, really vast. But the point I wanted to make is that many of these initiatives actually align with the World Health Organization's long-standing definition of health, and that is as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. So in other words, music is being really effectively used for a treatment and a therapy, but it's also a vital part of health promotion and prevention of disease due to its protective factors, and that's what makes it incredibly powerful. So we see the spectrum from managing illness right up to what we might call the social determinants of health and macro sort of well-being of communities. And when I'm talking about social determinants of health here, I'm talking about all of those social and economic factors that actually influence the health and well-being of individuals and communities. It's not just those medicalised factors. What's so interesting about music is music has the capacity to work at that individual level, but also if we go up to that interpersonal level, up to that meso, as we call it, community level, and then right up to that macro social level as well. It can activate all of those social determinants of health. And so in our literature review, we really tried to capture those multidimensional benefits that can come, and we group them into social, cognitive, emotional, physical, spiritual, and identity. And so that really speaks to the way in which, tell me something else that can do that, really. No one has been able to tell me. Something that can activate things across all of those dimensions efficiently, cost-effectively, and often at the very same time. So that's a little snapshot whirlwind of the literature review, which you can take a look at. It's very digestible, and we've also made a summary version if you would prefer, not the heavy, longer version.
Yes, there is a 4-pager, but I do encourage you to grab the more than 4-pager, which will be available afterwards. It's really fascinating stuff, and whilst it may be, as you said, kind of confirming hunches we've all had, it is really incredible to read the amount of work and the depth of the work that's been done in this field. Just lastly, you mentioned in passing that music doesn't just have a place in a sort of therapy context, but also, I guess, what you'd call a preventative measure. What examples would there be of that, and how does music sort of prevent things going worse?
Well, of course, there are many well-being benefits that come from music making in terms of our own health, mood regulation, stress regulation, or stress decreasing. And I'm sure the other panellists are probably going to talk about some of those, whether you go and sing in a choir or even if you come and listen to a QSO concert. Of course, there are many physiological benefits that are happening and also the social benefits that are happening like there are in the room right now. All of those are protective factors for other things that can go wrong. And so I think that's really what's so powerful about music, and I think really taps in very nicely to the Health and Wellbeing Queensland agenda, which is really looking at those protective factors and how to prevent things rather than waiting till they've gone wrong.
Fantastic. Yes, well, look, that seems like a good point and a good moment to move on to Gemma to talk about the health and wellbeing. I'm delighted to reintroduce Gemma Hodgett, Executive Director of Health and Wellbeing Queensland. I'm also delighted to confirm that Health and Wellbeing Queensland is the principal partner of the QSO Health and Wellbeing Program. This partnership will ensure that everything we do here in QSO is best practice. We aim to ensure that everything we do at QSO has a health and wellbeing consideration to it. Gemma joined Health and Wellbeing Queensland in 2020 as General Manager to shape the strategic agenda of one of Queensland's newest statutory agencies, leading the teams responsible for health promotion, First Nations health, communications and engagement, and the Office of the Chief Executive. She's now the Executive Director. Gemma, welcome to our panel today.
Thank you, Hugh.
It's wonderful to have you. Can you tell us a little bit about what is Health and Wellbeing Queensland? What does it do and what sort of entity is it?
It is my great pleasure to do exactly that. Any opportunity to talk about our new statutory agency focused on the health and wellbeing of Queensland is just a privilege. It's very nice to see all of you, and a little bit of a hard act to follow. So, but I'm really privileged to be here. Look, put simply, Health and Wellbeing Queensland is a prevention agency. And we are here to make healthy happen for Queenslanders. Our strategy is multifaceted and it's complex at times, but we like to describe it as focused on physical activity, nutrition and wellbeing. And our aim is to prevent obesity and drive down chronic disease rates. That's our initial focus. So what led to the establishment might be useful, but I think it's been recognised by government that obesity is perhaps a silent pandemic or a problem equal to climate change. And if I was to paint a picture of what that looks like and why it's relevant, is that there's probably 2 billion people worldwide living with overweight and obesity. Closer to home, it's 1 in 4 kids and 2 in 3 adults who are living with overweight and obesity. So those statistics should potentially outrage you. We know 1 in 4 children living with overweight and obesity. 50% of our Aussie women enter pregnancy overweight or obese. And if you're a child living in a disadvantaged community, you're 2.5 times more likely to be overweight or obese. So that's of real concern to us here in Queensland, and that's the job we've been given. The statistics are alarming in anybody's mind, but then if you add in a pandemic, the single biggest health disruption of a generation, the statistics become even worse. So 45% of us, of Queenslanders, have reported putting on weight during COVID. That weight gain for many of us is over 5 kilos. That's okay. It's all right if it's us in the room. It is difficult. Mental health and wellbeing is a concern to at least 40% of us. So at a time where it's so important to maintain that connectedness, your social interactions, your health and your wellbeing routines, it's really hard to do it, but it's so critical that we get it right. There's never been a better time. So I just wanted to share with you what would Australia look like if everyone lived within a healthy weight range. What could you expect? And one of the major things we'd see from a government perspective is a easing of pressure on the health system, which probably would make Janine very happy to see less people in the EDs. But chronic disease rates, diabetes, would be down by 53%. 53%. Heart disease 25% and stroke around 21%. So this is about living within a healthy weight range to prevent chronic disease. So I think we'd love those type of results for our family, for our friends, for our future generations. And for us, prevention is key because it works. And when executed well, preventative action and investment is far more effective than treating the disease in of itself. And some studies have shown us that for every dollar invested in prevention, it's a $14 return. So the sad thing about that is that it's only 2% of the state budget that is spent on preventative health, and that is a lot less than the UK and Canada and other places. So the problem's costing us about 11.2 billion, but we're only investing 2%. So it is worth Health and Wellbeing Queensland being a strong advocate for prevention because it works. So Hugh, that's having painted a pretty dire position. Enter HWQ, enter Health and Wellbeing Queensland, which was established by the current Deputy Premier in recognising the issues that I've just outlined for you. And look, we have been established only 2 years, but we've evolved so rapidly since. And I'm so proud of the team that we've assembled across the state that are working hard for all of you to make healthy happen for Queensland. So we do that through 3 basic principles, which is prevention, a population approach, so how can we reach the right people at the right time, not the worried well, but those that really need us the most. And of course we underpin everything we do with research and take a strong equity lens. So that's what we do at Health and Wellbeing Queensland, Hugh.
Wow, so you guys have a heck of a job and a huge task ahead of you.
We do.
What do you think the value is of Health and Wellbeing Queensland partnering with QSO? And obviously you were talking about Health and Wellbeing Queensland being very much focused on the preventative focus and the preventative lens. What benefits would there be partnering with QSO, and what sort of things could we help Health and Wellbeing address through this partnership?
Thank you. I'm so glad you asked. There are a couple of key Health and Wellbeing Queensland programs I'd love to talk to you about, but the most exciting in our newest partnership is in fact the QSO, and I wanted to congratulate them on their initial plan and for inviting us to be their principal partner. But the entities are so aligned because First Nations, equity of access, and community is exactly what we're about. So no one can underestimate the power of music, and that growing body of research is something that we're all here to talk about and learn about today. But you know, the importance of your mental health and overall well-being extends, you know, can be different things for many people, but for the likes of everybody here, I'm sure that music is essential to that. One of the benefits of the partnership for HWQ is that the extraordinary following and success of the Symphony in Queensland means that together we can reach more Queenslanders in more areas, and that our message hopefully around those areas of physical activity, nutrition and wellbeing will reach as many people in Queensland as possible.
That's fantastic. So in your work, just I'm curious to know, obviously you're based in Brisbane and this is the capital of Queensland. How do you guys roll out sort of your agendas or your ideas or your programs throughout, you know, what is the most decentralised state in Australia?
Yeah, and look, that's a great question, and one that we've been very cognizant on from establishment is not to be too southeast Queensland, because what we know about prevention and health is that it's perhaps not Toowong that we're trying to fix, if I'm honest. So, you know, we take an equity lens, as I described, to all the work that we do, and I'd really love to talk to you about that. That's probably our signature piece of work, Hugh, that is intended to create a statewide equity framework. So for equity, for us, it's so important for health of Queenslanders because it's about removing the barriers that mean that kids and adults, depending on where they live, their postcode determines how well their life expectancy and outcomes are. So it's not often about putting in more supports, but it's removing the barriers that create those inequitable outcomes. So for Health and Wellbeing Queensland, it's much broader than you know, obesity prevention, but what will really tackle obesity is all of those social determinants that Bridie spoke about. So we've assembled 23 state government agencies, which is no mean feat if you know government at all, and we are trying to address housing, employment, even storage of food, and then it is all the much more complicated in our First Nation space where logistics, graphically dispersed area, and even storing food and preparing food. So our two biggest priorities are the First Nations agenda and equity, removing barriers and solving problems that are whole of government problems. So Hugh, we try and work with communities and people that are ready for us, that need us. We listen to the local leaders, particularly in First Nations communities. So it's never about us imposing our agenda on them, but when they're ready and they are wanting our support, that's where we go, to the people that need us most.
Yeah, fantastic.
Thanks.
We have had to do a lot of work ourselves in QSO in this space. Many of you here are supporters, and many of you here do support our work in the regions. And without your support, we wouldn't be able to go. So the government funding that is apportioned to us doesn't cover us getting out to these places like Chinchilla, Miles and Roma and the partnership we have there, like Gladstone, like Cairns, Mackay, Bundaberg next year. There's many places in the regions we can only go to because of your support, and we are incredibly thankful for the support of our patrons and partners in being able to do that. And so with us having that regional lens, it seems like an excellent partnership to be making with Health and Wellbeing Queensland, given you guys are statewide and you are prioritising that.
We are. Hugh, I just wanted to mention our kids. It would be remiss of me not to talk about the future health of Queensland kids. And just to your point, we have trials in Bundaberg, Bowen and Logan going on currently in Queensland schools. Our flagship program is called Pick of the Crop. So it's about bringing the fruit and veggies to the kids so that they can touch, feel, utilise and learn. The parent connection is really strong. So we're in 35 state schools, 10,000 kids currently undergoing Pick of the Crop and enjoying, having that real experience, because it's the healthy behaviours in kids that are set them up well for life, and it's part of that preventative action. And the other thing we're trying to do, obviously, with children is when parents go out on a Friday night after a long week, no one wants to fight about the chicken nuggets on the menu. So we want to dial up the fruit and veg intake and provide healthier menu choices for adults in stadiums potentially, pubs, clubs, etc. So our kids are so important to our agenda because that's what's going to change the trajectory of the obesity pandemic in Queensland.
That's great. Thank you, Gemma. Well, that's an excellent point to transition on to Dr. Dimity Dornan, because much of your work has focused on children, even from as young as birth. I'll just introduce you quickly, though. You're Executive Director and founder of Hear and Say, hearing health specialist and bionics advocate, a speech pathologist for more than 5 decades. Dr. Dimity Dornan has changed the lives of thousands of children and young adults through Hear and Say, an organisation she established 25 years ago. Dimity has devoted her career to helping deaf children to listen and speak by training their brains to use implantable bionic technologies like the cochlear implant. Hear and Say is QSO's community partner, and even QSO staff, I'm excited to announce, will volunteer at Hear and Say Centre as part of this music program. So Dimity, thank you very much for joining us today. Could you please just give us a brief overview about Hear and Say? What sort of organisation is it now, 25 years after its genesis and after you founded it?
Thank you, Hugh. It's actually 30 years next year. I can't believe it. Yeah, so I'm absolutely amazed to have got this far. I thought I'd try it for 4 years when the bionic ear or the cochlear implant was coming. I could see the value of it. And for you people who love music, and you know how important your brain is, the connection for me between hearing and the brain was just so obvious. And I'll explain to you a little bit about that. And it was just a no-brainer for me to try and show the government really how well the bionic ear or cochlear implant would work with very young children who've never heard a thing before, even children who can't hear a jumbo jet going straight over their head. We can have them hearing and speaking at the same rate as children with normal hearing with this amazing technology, but only if you do it all right and with the help of music. Because a musical pattern is the very first thing that these children who've got a brain that's a tabula rasa, never heard before, brains never stimulated in that area, and guess what? It's the musical pattern that the first thing is that we can teach the children to recognise, which is quite magic. So that's why music is so, so important to these children.
You mentioned just about that musical pattern. What does that look like are you playing the children's sounds or speech? What's that musical pattern look like?
Both, but very early on, we'd start to teach the children a meaningful sound attached to an object. For example, you might teach them two contrasting sounds and objects. Shh is baby's asleep, and you'd have a baby there. But the musical pattern behind that is ra-da-da-da, and then
Baby asleep.
rah is a great big lion. And you'd teach the children, using a lion and a baby, for example, the differences between those two. But what they're really hearing the differences between is the intonation pattern or the musical pattern behind it. And that's why the very first thing that we can get them to recognise when they move on to sentences is the musical pattern in the sentence. And so that's why we use a lot of music, stories, songs. We teach the parents how to do it as well. And that way they very quickly learn to put a meaning to what they hear. And then they understand it and they learn to speak it using the same listening that we've given them.
It's incredible. So this field of auditory processing and then how that affects everything else. We were talking a little bit backstage before about the research that's being done. You're talking about sounds and hearing, and this really is the first step for a child or for a human in developing everything else, such as speech, but also reading. Can you tell us a little bit about the connection between hear it, say it, read it, and that sort of thing, or just how does the auditory processing affect all these things?
Well, not many people really get the connection between hearing and speaking and reading. But when we're able to hear the differences, the little differences between sounds, we're able to spot the differences which allow us to choose those sounds over other sounds. And it's that being able to spot the difference that eventually leads to being able to understand a whole string of words. And of course, if you don't hear the sounds, you'll never be able to read them. And therefore, you need to be able to read them as well to go well with school. So the whole chain is connected.
And the research suggests that if a child is behind in hearing, they can be behind in speaking, which means they can be behind in reading. And that being behind in reading extends throughout school. The child doesn't necessarily catch up. It takes a long time. They're always sort of playing catch up, as it were, until adult years. So it's really important stuff, this auditory processing stuff. To see a child hear for the very first time must be an absolutely extraordinary thing.
Absolutely remarkable. I get goosebumps and all my hairs stand on end just talking about it because it's so magic. But the place to look is not to the child, it's on the parents' faces, because they're the ones that have this extraordinary experience of, yes, my child can learn to listen, my child will learn to speak, my child will be able to go to school, and we've told them all these things, but they don't believe it till they see it. Yeah. So it's really, really good.
That's incredible. Now, it's not just children that Hear and Say work with. So you also work with adults, and in particular, there's some connections and some work you've been doing exploring hearing or auditory processing and degenerative brain conditions like dementia. Can you tell us a little bit about how those things are linked and how Hear and Say is sort of joining those dots potentially?
Absolutely. As time's gone on, we've realised the important things that are involved in building the brain from scratch. And if you can do that, you can help it from unravelling at the other end. If you don't use it, you lose it. If your hearing gets down, you're not using a lot of your brain, up to a fifth of it. And that brain degenerates fairly quickly. It's not necessarily so. It's not directly related, but it's fairly likely. So my message would be, when you get to midlife, you need to start watching your hearing, get a baseline with a fully qualified audiologist, and make sure that you watch that baseline. And whatever the audiologist says to do, do. Don't not wear your hearing aids. Don't put your hearing aids in the top drawer, because what you're doing is you're keeping your brain in the top drawer. So it's really important, and an important message for everybody. The World Health Organization has a wonderful key message for 2022, and that is that there's really, everyone can have healthy hearing for life if they just watch all the different parts that keep their hearing healthy. Using it in social situations, like listening to music, is one of those things. Staying connected with people is one of those things. And then making sure that if your hearing drops, you put it back there just where it needs to be very quickly.
That's really fascinating. And also in the orchestra, as musicians, you'll be pleased to know we get audiograms every year in February to check on our hearing, and we use hearing protection as well. What sort of ways could Hear and Say and QSO collaborate, do you think?
Oh, there's so many ways I can think of. I think, first of all, the starry glow that you have, I would love to borrow some of that. So I'm very, very happy to be here today. But the public doesn't know just how aligned our two causes are. And they don't know just how important it is to go out there and pass on these messages. So I'm so happy to be working with these wonderful ladies here to be able to tell people this. 3, maybe 4 years ago, I was Queensland Australian of the Year in the senior category for the whole year. And what I did is I spent my own money, went out and travelled around the regions in Queensland and started to make sure people in seniors clubs understood the link up and the link up to keep being social. So it's really important to make sure that your friends know that.
Excellent. And look, we do have a lot of friends in QSO across the state.
I think you do.
Yeah. So
there was something else that I didn't say.
Please.
Being able to have the musicians go in to work with our children in their playgroups is just so invaluable, and the level that they're getting the listening at is just so extraordinary that I think money can't buy that.
absolutely. One of the highlights of my year is always going into my son's kindy to do music, and I bring just a range of instruments from home. So I bring my oboe, bring a guitar, I bring an accordion and these things. And the teachers say just seeing the children's behaviour change, you know, it's like flicking on a switch, and just seeing their listening starting to engage. It's a different language in a way from the day-to-day. It's wonderful when you see it.
Could I tell a story?
Please do.
Just a quick story. Hear and Say is right next door to the Australian Music Examination Board, which we thought when we went there we would be able to have a wonderful campus for early childhood. Unfortunately, one of the people who were involved in that didn't get their council approval. But we are able to take our children across every now and then. I think it's happened twice to the AMEB, to some of their concerts. One year I took a young child who had the worst cerebral palsy I had ever seen and have ever seen. She had no listening, no speech, and she couldn't control any of her movements. We took her in there with us, and as soon as she has a cochlear implant now, as soon as she heard the music, she quietened, and she got this grin on her face that just didn't stop. So I know that music is the key to people's soul, and I'd like to be able to be a part of that.
Thank you. That's amazing, Dimity. Well, and we hope you all would like to be part of that somehow. There's all little ways we can all be involved. I'm now going to invite up a member of QSO's staff, member of QSO's senior leadership team. This is Timothy Matthews, who will be coming up. He's our Director of Artistic Planning. And Tim is going to speak a little bit about one of those pillars that I was speaking of our QSO Health and Wellbeing initiative. So, Tim, welcome.
Thanks very much.
Lovely to have you here. One of those pillars that I mentioned was community, and how we interact with different communities, be it local, regional, First Nations, communities with special needs, aged care, and so forth. Could you tell us a little bit about a pilot program or some of the pilot programs in this community pillar? What are these pilot programs, and what sort of communities could they translate to?
Great, thank you very much, Hugh. It really builds upon just what you and Dimity were talking about, and about the experience of music and what that brings to people. So that story about taking the child to the cerebral palsy, one of our other community partners is Nabathong Special State School, which is out at Woolloongabba. I don't know if people know about that school. It's a small school. I can't remember the exact number of students there, but it's specialist teaching for students with vision impairment. So all of the students there are considered blind, but they also many of them have other conditions, including intellectual or physical impairments, autism, cerebral palsy, deafness, and other conditions. And music is at the heart of what that school does. And when we launched our We're Sharing the Joy program last year, a former principal nominated that school to be a place that we could go visit. So we went there in December. Some of the musicians you're going to hear in a minute were involved in that. And they played a program that involved Beethoven, some tango, a couple of other pieces, Michael Bublé's Christmas song with one of the students, because some of them are very able to sing and perform. And it was exactly what Dimity talked about in the effect upon music that we saw. So there were some students there, very, 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 very impaired. Their bodies calmed down. They stopped vomiting. They stopped convulsing. Music brought something to them. And out of that we thought, well, what's the sort of program that we could develop that all of our musicians could do if they feel comfortable with? What's the sort of learnings that we can also attach to that? Because Lee Strickland, who's the music teacher at Nabathong, like what you do, Dimity, uses music to help them learn how to do things. So she talks about, that one of the goals around a student might be to help them grasp a brush and to be able to brush their hair independently. So in the classroom, you use activities that involve rhythm and body percussion that can take, say, grasping a clapping stick or a drumstick and pretending to do that with your hair. So that you use music to help do that, which is exactly what you were saying, Dimity. So we've been working, a couple of people in my team have been working with 5 of our string musicians to develop a program that really, in a sort of 45-minute performance, that could be a little bit shorter, could be a little bit longer, depending upon the setting, because of course, students in these settings are also very particular. Some days are good days, some days are bad days. But that really, on a journey using music by Vivaldi, Piazzolla, the Harry Potter theme, some other pieces, helps them develop their oral and oral recognition skills, talks about dynamics, talks about tempo, the timbres of the different instruments, and also then lets the kids have their personal responses to the music. And then that then allowed us to explore those specific goals that Lee was talking about. And it also allows the musicians to then adapt their performance to each setting. So some of those settings, you might need to play the piece 3 times to help the kids be involved in it. In other settings, you might do the whole show right through. This also, then allows us to use that program in different ways as well. So, talking about dementia and aged care, this is a sort of program that we know could also work effectively with older people in those settings. One of our other We're Sharing the Joy is last year we went to Regis Care, and there was some, ex-QSO subscribers there, who came in rather befuddled, the music started, they come down. By the end of it, they were remembering that they knew the musicians. They could remember their names. They hadn't been able to do that at the start. So they're just some of the things that music helps people's brain patterns identify. So that's why we're creating this program with the string quintet. We'll do wind quintet, we'll do brass quintet. We've also, here in a couple of weeks' time, going to do similar work with our 13-piece ensemble, which is where we have one of each of the instruments. And there we'll have a presenter working with the musicians to demonstrate the instruments, to play a range of music. We've got some Hear and Say students and their families coming to that. Nabathong, the Children's Hospital, Red Hill, and also some of the Indigenous schools, especially Himba, which is out at Springfield, who we've got another relationship with. Because they're using, similar to Nabathong, music is at the core of what they're doing in terms of how they're hoping to help their students learn and engage. So.
It sounds very exciting, and Tim and his team have been doing a lot of work making these connections. And as an organisation like QSO, we are statewide, and we are the biggest performing arts organisation in the state. But in order to be effective, it's more probably a case of partnering with specific groups and probably going deeper rather than going wider. And once we get these pilot programs going, we can see the effect of sustained relationships with particular groups. Would that be right in saying?
That's exactly it, Hugh. Yeah. To develop these programs, and then, when we go into communities, go into the same schools, to help their students. Also we have resources that we develop around these, involving videos and things, so that they can be used in those settings as well. So.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Tim.
Thank you.